Great, sorry. Thanks very much for that very comprehensive introduction, Simone. So I'm Sinead Hines, as Simone said. My email is there at the bottom of the slide there, sinead.hines@universityofgalway.ie. If anybody wants to follow up with anything or wants a copy of the slides or anything once we're finished the talk. So presenting with me today are my colleagues Chris and Robert, and we're going to talk about a number of SWATs that or studies within a trial that we conducted as part of a feasibility trial. So the funding for this trial was from the Health Research Board, Definitive Intervention Feasibility Award that was awarded in 2018-19. So just to give you a bit of a background of where the SWATs that we're going to talk about sit. So the host trial was a trial, it's a feasibility trial, a single-blinded cluster randomized feasibility trial. And we were looking at an intervention called the COB-MS, or a cognitive occupation-based program for people with multiple sclerosis. So the trial itself was looking at this intervention, which focused on people with MS or multiple sclerosis who experience cognitive difficulties, which is seen in about 50 to 65% of people living with MS. So the feasibility trial randomized people to two groups. So people either received the COB-MS intervention or they were recruited to a waitlist control group. The intervention itself was delivered by occupational therapists, and I suppose importantly, and Chris will talk a bit more about this when he's talking about one of the SWAT therapists, were also participants, so they were recruited onto the trial as participants, but they ran the COB-MS with participants, so they were recruited and then they were trained to deliver the COB-MS itself. The aim of what we were doing, the aim of the feasibility trial, was to look at the feasibility of the trial and also the intervention itself, but we were also then looking at some of the preliminary efficacy of the intervention. And just to note that there was a number of changes that we made from kind of the original plan because of COVID-19. So everything was originally planned to be in person. So we had in-person data collection and in-person delivery of the intervention. But with the impact of COVID-19, we had to change this. So we went to remote delivery of the intervention and remote data collection. So that's kind of just a bit of a background. The objectives of the host trial, or the feasibility trial as a whole, are up on the slide here. I think the ones that are important in terms of the SWATs that we're going to present are the ones that I have kind of highlighted in that pinky maroony color. So the first was to field test the outcome measures and the procedures used. So we're not going to talk really about the outcome measures today. We did look at this in another SWAT that we're not going to have time to look at today, but we have the reference for it at the end, where we looked at the difference or whether remote delivery of outcome measures was equivalent to in-person delivery of the outcome measures. But we're going to look at some of the procedures that we use. So particularly here, as Simone mentioned, we're going to look at recruitment and retention. We are also looking at the we're investigating the barriers and facilitators of using the COB-MS. So look at this from the perspective of participants with MS and also the occupational therapists, which Chris will talk about in a bit more detail. One of our objectives was to deliver a SWAT, which we've done. The original SWAT was SWAT 1 that Robert's going to talk about in a minute. Overall, the results of our SWATs helped us, as well as the overall results of the feasibility trial, to determine whether or not it was appropriate to progress to a full definitive trial. Just to outline the SWATs that we conducted as part of this, and again, we're going to look at 4 of these today. So the first one that Robert's going to present on is to determine the impact of public and patient involvement, or PPI, designed participant information leaflet on recruitment. The second SWAT is to look at the impact of being deemed ineligible on people who want to participate. The third SWAT looks at the reasons why people decline to participate in the intervention or in the trial. And then the fourth one we're looking at today is what influences occupational therapists' decision to participate or to deliver the intervention. And then the fifth SWAT is there at the bottom for anybody who's interested. We can send on the paper for that. So I'm going to pass over now to Robert, who's going to talk a bit about PPI within the trial and SWAT 1.
So thank you very much, Sinead. The first thing I think really that I need to explain is what actually is PPI. And it stands for Patient and Public Involvement. And I think the real essence of PPI is that when a study is being done, research in any context, it is appropriate to have people who are living or have experience of that illness involved in that trial. The idea is nothing about us without us. And I think this is growing in popularity, and certainly this fortnight, there have been an awful lot of events in Ireland discussing patient and public involvement and how it impacts on studies, what we need to do to improve it, and what are the challenges that we're facing. But in this trial, the COB-MS trial, we have used patients in every stage of the study. Firstly, when the grant application was done, the MS Society was involved with that. And part of this whole idea is that we wanted to include a patient within the study group, within the management team of the study. I was employed as that person, and originally I was given the role of an assistant researcher. But however, over the course of the study, we realized that in fact, the role that a patient can play is much wider than just being the voice. And my title changed to being an embedded patient researcher. We also have a patient advisory panel, which is made up of people who are varying stages within their MS and also carers of people with MS. And this proved to be a very good grouping to bounce ideas off, because as the course of the trial was happening, I noticed things that as a patient needed to be changed. But as a check to whether I was right, we would go to our patient advisory panel, and then they would let us know Robert was right or he was wrong. And if I was correct, they would adapt and amend what my suggestions were so that we got the best result for the participants in the trial. We also have patients on the trial steering committee providing oversight to make sure that we're going down the right direction. And COVID, that has impacted all of us, and it impacted this trial as well. And we had to use the resources of the patient community to learn how to change this trial so it was more suitable in the COVID environment. We used resources like the Multiple Sclerosis Society, but also people who were involved in giving training to people with multiple sclerosis who had switched to an online version of their work, and we learned from their experience too. So Sinead, if you could go on to the next slide, please. So this first SWAT, study within the trial, is about the impact of PPI-designed participant information leaflets on recruitment. So if we go on to the next slide, please. The participant information leaflet is something that is given to somebody who is interested in being involved in a trial to let them know what to expect from this study. It goes through things like what is going to be the impact on their life, what is their commitment, what are we going to be studying, and what do we hope could be a potential outcome of the study. But understanding of these leaflets can often be poor in health-related research. And we were trying to examine what are some of the reasons for this and how it impacts on the retention of people involved in the trial. They're often lengthy, difficult to understanding, using terms that are familiar to researchers, but not necessarily to the patients who are involved in the study. So we were wondering whether if somebody with no experience of drafting a patient information leaflet could make a difference in the retention of patients within the trial. So we decided to compare a leaflet that was drafted by a researcher or a patient. And I was given that task of drafting the patient one. So if we go on to the next slide, please. We wanted to see when we gave out these leaflets, and we did a double blind where not only did the person who was sending out the leaflets not know who was going to get them, but the participants didn't know that they were going to be in one group or the other. What we wanted to check and what we wanted to really understand about this was, did we improve the number of participants who wanted to become involved in the study, how long they stayed involved, and their understanding of the sheet? Were we able to improve the readability of it, the accessibility, and the decision conflict scale? And this is something that I struggled to understand what it meant, but thankfully through a bit of education with Chris and Sinead, I have learned what that means. So if we can go on to the next slide, please. So what did we do? We drafted 2 versions of this sheet. And it was in my first week in being involved in this study back in July 2019, I was asked to draft a patient information leaflet. And I did not know what that was really. But in many ways, that was beneficial, because I asked then Sinead, who's the principal investigator on the study, what is it? What should it include? And we went through various different headings, and I did my best to draft something that I thought would be suitable for the MS community, the community from which I am. This was double-blinded and randomized, and both those who are participating and those collecting the data did not know who got what leaflet. So it's a double blind. And there was no inclusion or exclusion criteria. Now, this is where you get to see perhaps the difference. 2 obviously different versions of this leaflet. The one on the left is the one that I drafted, and the one on the right is the researcher drafted one. And you can immediately see a difference between the look of both of these leaflets. If we go on to the next slide, please. So what did we find out? Now, here's quite a complex diagram. I'm not going to go through it in detail, but if you look at the beginning, we had 243 people who applied to this trial. But when we get to the very bottom of this, and we'll make these slides available at the end, you will see that effectively there was very little difference between the left side and the right side in the amount of people who stayed within the trial based on the leaflet that they received. So there seems to be no impact on retention, certainly on which leaflet was received by the participant. So if we could go on to the next slide, please. However, we did uncover some stuff as far as patient understanding of the leaflet. We were delighted when Lydia O'Sullivan did a review of the 2 leaflets, and she came up with a number of conclusions. If you look at the right of this page, you'll see the analysis, and the Flesch reading scale ease is an assessment of how easy that document is to read. And you can see that the one done by the researcher or the postdoc was considered difficult, whereas the one that I drafted was considered to be plain English. The next line under tells you the age of the person. So you needed to be 18 plus to understand the postdoc one, but you could be 14, reading level of 14, and understand the one that I drafted. And even still, that is too old. We should have been aiming for something around the age of 10. The sentence structures were looked at, how many passive verbs were in the text. And this is actually really important, that whether you use passive or active words. If you have too much passive stuff in it, it makes it more difficult to understand. And the suitability of the materials was considered to be 80% for the patient information leaflet. Now, so you could see there's a couple of positives that you highlighted. The use of the font, the size of the font, and even whether you use upper or lowercase letters in the headings, all can aid the reader to understand it a little bit better. However, there were things that could have been improved. So if we didn't underline the headings, have more bullet points and numbering in it, and use plainer English. And what is something that neither of us did is to use any diagrams or pictures. However, I did use a table in the one that I drafted. And the passive voice, this is also key. So if we can move on to the next slide, please. So what do these results mean? Well, there's no impact on retention, which is interesting in itself. We also had the participants felt that they wanted to get involved in this study because of a health benefit for them. And this is where the decision conflict scale comes in, that people may have felt, the participants felt that if they did not give a positive response to the survey that we asked of them, that it could have a negative impact on their participation in the study. They wanted to be a good candidate. They wanted to be accepted. And we think that this is something that maybe patients should be made more aware of, that it doesn't impact their ability to be involved in the study. We are just wanting to know what their honest opinion is, and maybe we could be a bit clearer in that. So if we could go on to the next slide, please. What are the next steps? Well, as far as the participant information sheets are concerned, we think that the patient is needed. It adds an extra dimension to the leaflet that is being produced, and it's easier to understand from the patient point of view. Also, we feel that because of our experience within this trial, in the COB-MS trial, the value of inputs all throughout the trial has been quite significant. And we would be advocating for more patient input in research over the coming years and on into the future. This will make the materials that are being produced suitable for the people who are being researched. Thank you very much. I'll pass you on to Chris now.
You just still muted there, Chris.
Yep, there you go. Thank you.
Thanks, Mel. Hi, everyone. I hope you're well. Thanks very much for that, Robert. So I'm going to kind of continue on from where Robert left off, which is essentially what happens following provision of participant information. And as Robert was talking about, people will read and they will try their best to understand whether or not the program is a good fit for them. And I use that word fit because it will come up later on in our discussion of the following SWATs. But in thinking about this question, if we think about RCTs, as researchers, we provide people their information sheets, and those who are interested get back to us, and we assess their eligibility, and if they are eligible and they consent, great, welcome aboard, and onwards we go, and we hope to have some good retention rates and get on with our program. But very often we fail to think about those who have declined participation or were deemed ineligible for participation. And apart from taking numbers, we don't really know very much about that, and there's quite a lack of research in that area. So that's what these SWATs, these upcoming SWATs that we're going to discuss, that's what they're all about. It's what happens to these people who kind of fall off our radar as researchers. And there we go. So recruitment is more than advertising or even providing interested parties with information sheets. Screening and understanding potential participants is a crucial step for helping us to achieve our desired sample. We know that researchers develop a set of criteria which helps us to ensure the validity of our samples. And adherence to these criteria diminish the likelihood of confounds and reduce bias that may impact the ability to confidently observe potential treatment effects. But what happens to potential participants who are deemed ineligible? So often, as I was saying, once a participant is deemed ineligible, they're no longer observed in the trial. And despite research on these rates and reasons for ineligibility and the impact on the trial under evaluation, no research was found regarding impact on the person of being deemed ineligible. Being deemed ineligible may have negative impacts on how patients perceive themselves, for example, without use or being denied potentially beneficial treatment. And then it also has negative impacts on us as researchers, because it may have a negative effect on how these people who are deemed ineligible, how they perceive the nature of research. For example, its usefulness in real world settings, or even the likelihood of such individuals participating in other research studies. Simply, what I mean is, if you're deemed ineligible, will that leave a bad taste in your mouth regarding getting involved in research again, or even taking word from research in the future? So better understanding in this context could yield some beneficial outcomes for both those deemed ineligible, as well as to those who are designing research. So we conducted a series of qualitative interviews to learn more about this phenomenon, and we did this through IPA. So what were our criteria? Like most RCTs, we had a slew of them, and each and every one of these criteria had a specific purpose. Okay, so each one, when we look at it, there is a justifiable reason for why that criterion is there. Every criterion has a very specific purpose. The criteria, as I'm sure you're well aware, they're not designed to alienate people or isolate individuals. They're there so that we can design and conduct the best RCT we can, so that our findings can then be implementable for people in the future and for larger groups of people. But it's of utmost importance, of course, in order to avoid confounds and bias, to stick to the strict criteria. So let's look at our numbers. At the time of conducting the study, 178 individuals wished to progress after receiving their participant information sheet, and 62 were deemed ineligible. There's a breakdown of what we're looking at here, and as you can see, the top 3 reasons for ineligibility were not having cognitive difficulties. Okay, so they violated that criterion. They violated having no neurologic history other than MS, as well as no history of major depressive disorder, schizophrenia, or bipolar disorder 1 or 2. You'll see there's actually quite a spread in those numbers, where 72% of those who were deemed ineligible didn't actually have cognitive difficulties to the standard, or to the level, I should say, requisite for this particular study as determined by the MSNQ. So that goes from 72% down to 8.1 and then 4.8%. So purposeful sampling was used for interviews. 8 categories of ineligibility were identified, and 1 individual from each was randomly selected to be invited to interview. Individuals ineligible for differing reasons would better facilitate a more informative and richer account of perceptions of themselves and the nature of research. Though ineligible for differing reasons, the cohort was homogeneous. For example, living in Ireland, having MS, expressing interest in participating in the host trial, and who were otherwise eligible to participate apart from 1 or 2 reasons. And I say 1 or 2 reasons because if you can see the highlighted criteria there for those that were violated, you've got 9 there, but we had 8 categories. Some, like I said, we had 1 interviewee who actually violated 2. So we actually managed to accomplish getting a voice back from everyone for every reason of ineligibility. For those of you who are methodologically concerned, in terms of going for 1 per each category, people who are familiar with IPA, generally it's you want a homogeneous sample, and trying to get Homogeneity throughout the sample is quite desirable. But looking at it in this context, for the reasons I explained below, we did actually have quite a deal of homogeneity. So we're sound on that perspective. Qualitative interview data were collected through semi-structured approach and analyzed thematically through IPA. Interviews were conducted through telephone to reduce burden of participation. Another methodological issue that needs consideration, obviously, IPA is commonly conducted face-to-face, but given the fact that these participants were deemed ineligible for the host trial, we didn't want to put any extra burden on them to take part and let their voice be heard. And as well, given that these interviews were conducted by an experienced researcher and kind of knew what they were doing, essentially that facilitated having run these on the phone. Moreover, 2 participants were asked to member check the analyses, confirming consistency between or among perspectives, thus allowing for confirmation of trustworthiness, findings reflecting the experiences of those deemed ineligible. The member checking was also interesting because it actually had a positive impact on 2 of the participants, because they felt like they were getting involved with the research in a way, and they kind of counteracted some of the negative impacts that we kind of alluded to earlier, but we'll discuss further on. So from this, 5 themes were identified. The first, being deemed ineligible, is emotion and reaction evoking. So our quote here, I cherry picked a few of the more interesting ones. So yeah, it's a bit upsetting, to take that. That's another hole I don't fit into. It's not easy. So the idea that explaining to an individual that they're not eligible to take part in research that more or less seems to them to be quite a good fit, it's often tough for them to hear. Now, some of our participants were more open to hearing about why, and some were a little bit more kind of closed and kind of said, yeah, that's fine, thanks a million, good luck, goodbye. But from all of our interviews, we found that, there is some kind of feeling you get when you're told, hey, this isn't for you. Number 2, doing your bit, helping others and increasing the value of research. The quote here, you're putting yourself forward in the hope that it will help somebody. That's the way I would look at research, like if they can find something in me. So people want to participate, and Robert said this earlier on, people want to participate because, if they're not doing it for themselves, they're doing it for other people in a similar position for them. So there's kind of a good Samaritan effect here that, they're being productive in their very specific day-to-day in terms of living with their chronic illness, in this case being MS. The third one, communication of ineligibility, understanding, clarity, and phone calls. So just as our participant information sheets need to be clear and understandable and accessible to the readers, so does this communication of ineligibility. Now, I spoke obviously with a few of these individuals, and they reported that some of them had taken part before in research, and not everything had been explained to them, and they wish that they had more explained. And depending on the nature of ineligibility, such as in our study, you might get an email back depending on it. Now, those who were screened for cognitive difficulties, that's those 72% that I had mentioned earlier, this was done on the phone. So they knew pretty much right away whether or not they were going to be eligible or ineligible. And so they had that feedback right away on the phone. So if they had any questions, it was great. Sometimes, however, it would have been an email, depending on how they responded to the email correspondence. So they may not have spoken directly with someone and may have felt, right, that's it, and not wanted to email back asking why, where it might be easier on the phone. And we'll discuss that a little bit more down the line. But our quote here, I kind of wish I knew more. And if the answer was the same, fine, but it just felt like it would have been nice to have one bit of discussion about why it didn't work out. Sort of, like when you break up, they say, it's really not you, it's me, I had no idea what the difficulty was. Moving on to the fourth theme, appreciation for those who express interest. Even if it's just a simple email to all participants, give us a bit of closure and to give us the results, because a lot of surveys just do that email of thank you very much and all of that, but you never hear what exactly was achieved. So even if people are deemed ineligible, we have to be clear in the reason for why, but we also have to be clear in our appreciation and our thanks to them for even showing interest. Now, you might do that in an email and that's fine, and we might do that on the phone and that's fine too, but sometimes the participants want something a little bit more tangible, shall we say. So even if it was an email when the trial was done to forward on results and findings, or even letting them know in said correspondence upon when they're being told that they're ineligible, that, if they'd like, we could forward on the findings at a later date if that was something that they'd be interested in, to let them know what we actually found. And finally, subsequent perceptions and attitudes towards research. Now, this is an interesting one. In the 8 interviews we had, everyone was in agreement, essentially, that being deemed ineligible wouldn't have any effect on them or their interest in research. They would continue on applying for research that they found was a good fit for them. And even if it wasn't for them personally, like I said, it's going back to theme 2, doing your bit. They seem very happy to help, other people who are in a similar position to themselves. However, one person did not agree with that, and I want to make a point of that. Their quote here, I've been mindful of the fact that they mightn't want me again. So yeah, that does concern me. Now, of course, this is the minority finding here, but it is still 1 in 8, and it's something we can think about in terms of future RCTs when we have larger groups, and when we apply 1 out of 8 across larger samples, we might see a substantial amount of people who might feel this way, and future RCTs thereafter. That we don't want to alienate our populations, our potential sample pools, okay? So we want to be clear, we want to show that we're appreciative, and we want to give our ineligible participants opportunities to learn as much as to why they weren't a good fit, and explain to them the research methodology in an accessible, clear manner, much like Robert was describing before. So our implications here, simply being deemed ineligible can elicit negative emotional outcomes, which are potentially more impactful, contextually speaking, given that such individuals are simultaneously living with at least one chronic illness. It's not likely to change perceptions or attitudes towards research, perhaps as a result of a desire to help others similar to themselves. However, it can, which may be detrimental to future research, wherein there are smaller pools of potential participants from which to recruit. Negative impacts can be diminished through advising of ineligibility in a personalized way, such as over the telephone, with enhanced clarity regarding the reasoning behind the decision, providing opportunities to ask questions, and ensuring thanks and appreciation for their time and that interest is communicated. And so that's SWAT 2. Moving on to SWAT 3, we have a very similar question as before. And to reiterate, screening is a crucial step for helping researchers achieve their desired sample and appropriate design. However, just as researchers screen their participants, the potential participants actually screen us, and that's the purpose of the information sheet. They're reading through and they make a decision as to whether or not the study is for them or not. So what we're talking about essentially is a group of quote unquote decliners, and that's what we'll be referring to them from here on in, decliners. Much like the rationale earlier on, once people decline participation, they kind of fall off the radar of researchers. And no, we don't really ever see any research that says, hey, you know, whatever happened to those people? And likewise, what happened during their decision making? So understanding these kinds of issues and indeed patient populations is of utmost importance to facilitating attainment of desired samples. One of the things we bumped into when kind of designing this SWAT was, you know, are these declining participants or participants who declined? And the wording of this was rather interesting, especially when we were designing the protocol for it. It became very meta, having them having declined the host trial but agreed to participate in this. We wanted to explore the reasons not to participate in the host trial, as well as perception of research. So upon ceasing recruitment for decliner interviews, 228 individuals had expressed interest in the host trial. Of these, 17 communicated their decline. Please note, though, that 37 had halted their correspondence, which can be considered decline by default. Researchers were unable to make contact to invite them for this decliner interview. So, you know, one kind of caveat to this research is that, you know, there are different types of decliners. There are those who express their explicit decline, such as the 17 that we're looking at specifically in this SWAT, but there is another cohort, decline by default, these non-correspondence individuals. So this is important as well to think about, especially in designing ways in which we can maintain an open correspondence with those who have expressed interest in participating. So those 17 individuals who were eligible for the SWAT were invited to participate through a phone call, and 7 agreed to take part. Data were collected through a series of semi-structured one-to-one telephone interviews and analyzed thematically. Then afterwards, a focus group was conducted with our PPI panel to review the findings and further elaborate on concepts and themes. The addition of the PPI focus group was implemented in order to add both depth and richness to the analysis and interpretation of findings, and also to provide a means of ensuring trustworthiness of phase 1 data. All data from phases 1 and 2 were collected and analyzed through reflexive thematic analysis. A little bit more detail on phase 2. 3 of the 5 PPI panel members from the host trial were available to participate. The focus group was presented and asked the same semi-structured interview questions as the decliners to explore consistency between what the panel identified as potential reasons for decline with the actual phase 1 responses. Questions were asked and responded to prior to being advised of the decliner responses in order to limit any potential bias on behalf of the PPI panel. Following presentation of phase 1 findings, PPI members were asked to comment and elaborate in light of both their perspectives regarding potential reasons for decline and their working understanding of the host trial. So out of the 17 that were eligible to take part, only 7 interviews were conducted, but 15 of those who declined the interview were very happy to provide a brief explanation for their decline, and some provided multiple reasons, but broadly speaking, these regarded their candidacy or their perspective on their candidacy, scheduling, worries and fears, their perceived mental well-being, unrelated health problems, and unspecified personal reasons. So our findings, phase 1 themes. Despite declining to participate, decliners still viewed research, their interest in it, and its potential value in a positive light. So it wasn't the research itself; they valued the research. There's our first quote. I'm being blocked out here. Everyone, yeah, there we go. Everyone should do research if they can, if not for yourself, for the health of others. Because if you do enough research, you might get some good out of it. Our second theme, perception of the study's relevance to the individuals with respect to fit. That word fit, I brought it up earlier, that was a big theme as well. Was the study a good fit for them? Was there too much commitment? Maybe the comorbidity and other symptoms that they might be experiencing alongside their MS, as well as their perception of their candidacy. So for example, it came across as this all singing and all dancing, and I'm not all singing and all dancing. I thought it would be interfering too much in my life. The third theme there is misinterpretation of participant information. For example, with respect to target demographic and study requirements, our quote here, I didn't read through it 3 or 4 times, but I did go through the information sheet. I got the wrong impression because I thought it was going to take more of a chunk over my life. Better stop now rather than go ahead and waste more resources on this. And number 4, ignorance is bliss. The desire to abstain from research that could potentially draw too much of the individual's attention to their own chronic illness, which they felt could have negative consequences. It'd make it even more obvious that that's what my symptoms are, and I don't want to know about it. I prefer to try not to think about it, and if I go on with the study, I would be forced to think about it. Phase 2 then corroborated these findings and elaborated a bit. So they acknowledged the potential benefits of taking part in research, with some having added value of potentially filling in gaps with respect to a lack of services. They found that fit could be conceptualized as contextual reasons for declining regarding not only practicalities like we were talking about commitment and candidacy, but as well reasons for declining as a means of self-preserving and avoiding feelings of being overwhelmed. And that ties in a bit with this idea, the 4th theme, ignorance is bliss. So misinterpretation of participant information as well. The PPI panel said, it may have come from, the participants' backgrounds. For example, a background in science would help avoid misinterpretation, but not everyone has such a background, so clarity is key. So that kind of goes back again to SWAT 1, what Robert was saying. If we're clear in our information sheets about exactly what we're doing, we can help minimize this misinterpretation. So whereas in SWAT 1, there might have been a lack of statistical significance of differences between the 2 participant information sheets, but we find that misinterpretation is a very big factor and has an effect qualitatively speaking here. And finally, ignorance is bliss. The PPI panel equated the theme with denial as a sort of coping mechanism, with acceptance of their MS occurring on both an emotional and intellectual level, in which the relationship between these may play an important role in their decision to decline. So the implications of this, most reasons were of a personal nature rather than perceived problems with the trial's intervention, which is nice to hear from a researcher perspective, but at the same rate, when we want people to actually participate, we have to think about the nature of their personal reasons and their perspectives, and try to accommodate them as much as possible. So the 4 identified themes cumulatively suggested that though decliners see the value of research aimed at their particular chronic illness, there remained the potential for declining as a result of either misconstruing the details of the study or perceiving participation as not being a good fit for them, as some may already feel a capacity with respect to how they cope with their MS. Thus, not participating may be their way of prioritizing their own health. So moving on, these past 2 SWATs with regarding ineligibility and decline, very PPI focused, particularly with respect to the patient. And we know the nature of PPI, but something that cropped up for us in our consideration of our 3rd SWAT was whether or not PPI actually ends at patients or even the public. So obviously PPI is about involving the public and patients in research. But the question becomes, does that include any cohort that isn't involved in conducting research, provided that they're a key stakeholder? But we ask ourselves, what about healthcare service providers and allied health professionals who implement evidence-based research on a daily basis? Just because they do this doesn't mean they were involved in the research itself, despite their profession's important link with applying evidence-based research. In the host trial, occupational therapists were recruited as participants to actually deliver the intervention. And so like the last SWAT, we were interested in looking at some of those who took part, specifically those who were allocated to the control condition, as well as those who declined. Both cohorts, and specifically those who declined, offered some very interesting reasons. So of course, we conducted another SWAT, and we explored the influences of occupational therapists' expression of interest in delivering COB-MS regarding reasons behind the decision to participate or not participate, and the potential barriers and enablers for helping to conduct research, particularly RCTs like COB-MS. So we didn't do one-to-one interviews this go round. We conducted a series of focus groups to gather information while capitalizing on the shared ideas and motivation for participation that a group environment provides. And they were used to support interactive discussion, resulting in an added depth of information. Data were analyzed thematically. So we had 50 occupational therapists who expressed interest in the host trial. 3 were ineligible, and 20 of the remaining 47 consented to participate. 24 decliners were invited to participate in the SWAT, as were those allocated to the waitlist control condition of the host trial. At this stage of the trial, we had 9. Being part of the waitlist control condition was important because they had not been advised of the study procedures or the program content. We thought that having that knowledge could potentially bias certain perspectives. So we only went with the control condition for this. Notably, previous research has actually looked at healthcare providers in this context, but such research focused on those who were already recruited or actively engaged with the research program, not those who declined, or even those who just took part in the control condition. So altogether, 33 occupational therapists were invited to participate in the focus group. 15 consented and were able to attend. And so we had 3 focus groups with a mix of decliners and controls. Notably, all participants were female. Methodologically speaking, this is not actually biased. Surprisingly, this is quite representative of the OT sample population. Of the 50 occupational therapists who actually expressed interest in taking part in the entire trial, only 1 was male. So like I said, again, this sample was actually quite representative. So the primary reasons for wanting to get involved in research on the basis of being occupational therapists were having an interest in the condition and or the symptoms being studied, promoting client support and service development, and upskilling. So those are actually fleshed out a good bit in our 3 themes that we found. So theme 1, motivation to get involved in research can be influenced. And we saw this through a number of sub-themes, including having a motivated interest for getting involved, seeing the merits of the research program and understanding those merits, seeing the potential for their own enhancement, like I was saying earlier, in terms of upskilling, seeing value for their clients and their own practitioner characteristics, I guess their own disposition towards research. So our quote here, well, what drew me to this kind of research was that it seemed to be a clear pathway and program. Research can seem quite vague, so I felt maybe motivation came to me because I had worked with the patient population before, and I am interested in MS patients. And I think it sounded like there was a structure and a plan to it, and I think that helped it. Now, in terms of theme 2, firefighting, that was a word multiple participants used. They talked about the barriers to participating and the barriers that are associated with the organizational culture of occupational therapy. And they were talking about how clinical practice comes first, above and beyond anything else, like getting involved in research. Practicalities in terms of facilitating the program, much like patient participants would have to consider certain practicalities. The organizational hierarchy within occupational therapy in Ireland, and again, as well, taking into account this Irish context. So the quote here, there isn't a culture to do research, no pathway. You're not encouraged to do it because the service comes first. Anybody I know that's doing research is either based in the university or students. And finally, theme 3, similar in ways to theme 2, but subtly distinct. It's the nature of research requires consideration, and the nature of research relative to the occupational therapist. So forgetting about the organizational culture for a minute, how occupational therapists approach research. They talked about not having many opportunities to participate in research. They talked about it, as you saw in the previous theme, about OT not really having a relationship with research in terms of conducting it, and likewise maybe lacking the confidence to do so, and further needing encouragement to do so if such an opportunity were to present itself. So the quote here, I only ever come across an odd time an OT that would be interested in doing research, or maybe having the confidence to do it. There's this kind of idea of, oh yeah, occupational therapists don't really do research. You often need to drag to come from someone, like from management, so that you're like, oh yeah, we're doing that. So there needs to be, going both ways, interest in the staff with the management going like, yes, let's do it. So implications of this research. The barriers identified have been established over time and may be difficult to overcome in the absence of an updated rethinking. Results may not be specific unto an Irish context, as the same barriers were found elsewhere. These findings may transcend occupational therapy to other health services. Methods of overcoming the identified barriers requires considerations to facilitate such involvement, and better understanding could further impact how we consider strengthening our research efforts and how current research policies are approached. Like traditional PPI, health service provider involvement should be accounted for during the research design phase, is vital for enhancing patient care, and should be encouraged through reinforcement of existing reasons and motivations for getting involved in research. So that's me done. I'm going to pass it back on to Sinead.
Thanks, Chris. We might actually just finish up there in the interest of time. But just I suppose we have some resources there, if people are considering a SWAT, the things to think about. There's lots of good priority setting papers out there, priority setting 1 and 2 in terms of recruitment and retention. The SWAT repository store in Queen's University Belfast is a good place to look if you're thinking about doing a SWAT, to see what's been done, what's registered. And there's a recent paper as well that looks at mapping SWAT priorities against kind of what's already been done. And we have the references for all those papers at the end of the presentation. That's them there actually, and we're happy to share the slides with anybody who might be interested. Thanks very much.